Hello. Namaste. If you're in Tamil Nadu, Di Irkinga. If you understand Marathi, Kase Ahat Tumi. A very great welcome to all of you to TEDx Gateway's webinar series, The World Has Changed. My name is Ralph Simon, and before we begin the session, here are some house rules for all of us. For attendees on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A panel in your screen below. We love getting questions, and I know that our guest today would certainly be very keen to answer them. This session is also being streamed live on TEDx Gateway's Facebook page, and the link for that Facebook page is www.facebook.com/TEDxGateway/live. I'll repeat that, www.facebook.com/TEDxGateway/live, and we'll be taking questions from the comment section on that Facebook feed as well. Well, today we've got something really special. We have our very esteemed guest, who's somebody who was born in Ahmedabad, but now lives in America, and today is actually coming to us from Puerto Rico, which is one of the American states, and we are greatly privileged to have with us Professor Achyuta Adhvaryu. And Professor Adhvaryu, or Ach as his friends call him, is an Indian-American economist. He leads research at the Good Business Lab, a non-profit organization he co-founded in 2017. He's also a professor of business economics and public policy at the very prestigious University of Michigan School of Business. He's a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He got his PhD in economics from Yale University, and he got a bachelor's in math and economics from the University of Pennsylvania. His area of specialization is fascinating. It's a research agenda at the intersection of business economics, development, and health. And his current work focuses on understanding worker productivity, worker happiness, and measuring the impact of interventions that increase productivity while improving key aspects of worker well-being. Such important things for all of those of you that are working in companies, large, medium, or small, and worker well-being is such a vital component in the Indian economy and in the global economy. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, a great TEDx Gateway welcome to Professor Achyuta Adhvaryu.
I'm a professor, so I often have the irrepressible urge to administer pop quizzes, so bear with me. Here's one for you. How many of you can tell me exactly where the shirt or the shoes you're wearing right now were made? What about the laptop or TV that you're watching this video on? Well, don't despair if you failed the quiz, because most of us probably did. We rarely stop to consider where our clothes or laptops or food all come from. Odds are they're made far away by someone you don't know, who works for a supplier you've never heard of, and who lives a very different life than you do. Increasingly, those lives are defined by struggle. The basic economic forces that drive businesses to compete and innovate are the same ones that squeeze more productivity out of frontline workers for less compensation. And amidst the economic hardship caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, businesses have doubled down on that paradigm, that wages and benefits for workers are costs to be minimized. But if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that the lives of these workers, their successes and failures, their health and well-being, are inextricably linked to our own lives. Businesses and consumers alike have come to understand just how valuable the health and safety and well-being of frontline workers is. When workers fall sick or have to leave work to care for loved ones or suffer devastating financial losses, their own lives are turned upside down. But their struggles also create ripple effects that impact their employers, their communities, and the end customers of the things they help and we've seen some pretty extreme manifestations of this during the current global crisis. Stores and factories have completely shut down when only a handful of workers test positive for coronavirus. There's also been massive protests and worker strikes that have brought entire cities to their knees. So given all this, it would seem that this interdependency between the well-being of workers and the well-being of businesses is pretty self-evident. But we collectively continue to frame the issue as a moral one. We tell the private sector, hey, we know it's a pain, we know it hurts your profit margins, but you have to treat your workers well because it's the right thing to do. And for the most part, the private sector points to the bottom line and says, hey, we wish we could do more, but we got to stay afloat. Well, I'm here to tell you that the data have spoken. And it turns out that the mandate for investing in the well-being of frontline workers is both moral and economic. Put simply, businesses thrive when they take care of their workers. And this means that there's more than just a moral imperative to share prosperity in the global economy. There's an economic imperative as well. The problem is there's no reliable source of hard evidence that demonstrates just how well specific investments in improving worker well-being can boost the bottom line for businesses. And that lack of clarity on impacts might be preventing a large number of businesses from investing more in their workers. So that's exactly what I set out to generate through my research and through the work I do with Good Business Lab, the organization I co-founded with Anant Naishadam and Ananta Hujan. Our process is pretty simple. First, we talk to both workers and managers and try to understand their respective pain points. And we use this information to design solutions that we think might meet workers' needs and also create business returns. We develop hypotheses about the solution's effectiveness, but importantly, we remain agnostic, so we wait to let the data tell us what the impacts are. And to be honest, we're often surprised by which ideas end up showing a clear positive impact and which ideas fail to accomplish much of anything. So next, we set up a rigorous study to evaluate impacts. To do this, we partner with businesses and we experiment right there on their shop and factory floors. We essentially do A/B testing just like any company would do to see whether a new product or service was worth implementing. This means we randomly allocate workers to either a treatment group who receives the program or a control group who doesn't. And then we track both groups over time so we can assess how different the treatment group's outcomes are compared to controls as a result of the program. We survey workers to measure their satisfaction levels, their physical and mental health, their career plans, their finances, their relationships, and much, much more. And then we work with businesses to get hard data on worker performance, things like productivity, absenteeism, wages, quit rates, career progressions, etc. These data allow us to estimate impacts of the program on both worker well-being and business outcomes. So what have we learned from all of this experimentation? Well, the biggest takeaway is that there are tangible things that businesses can do right now to make their workers happier and more productive. And I'm going to talk about 3 specific lessons that we've learned from our research about which investments matter. Lesson number 1, soft skills matter. Businesses tend to think of manual labor purely in terms of task completion. Soft skills like collaboration, communication, confidence. By this conventional wisdom, those features are only relevant in corporate knowledge worker contexts. But after we studied the root causes of productivity issues for frontline workers, we realized that soft skills could be as useful there as anywhere else. We found in one experiment that when we provided female garment workers in India with training in some of these skills, these women were better able to coordinate and resolve production issues with their coworkers and their managers, and this ended up increasing their productivity by 13% over controls. The training was relatively cheap, and so return on the investment for the firm was huge, about 250%, by the end of our tracking period. And it turns out it's not just about the soft skills of frontline workers that matter. Middle managers, the foremen, the supervisors, the shift managers, they also play a critical role in determining team productivity. As you might have guessed, it all comes down to effective leadership. Things like open communication, capacity building, planning, culture setting, emotional intelligence, conflict and stress management. These are all soft skills that middle managers often aren't equipped with, but absolutely need to enable their team's success. So we went back to the same garment factories in which we ran the first experiment, and we designed a new training specifically tailored for production line supervisors. And we found that training these middle managers and skills was incredibly effective. It boosted productivity by 5 to 7%, and importantly, it was good for frontline workers. They reported less distress at the workplace, higher job satisfaction, and greater retention compared to controls. And that's all because their managers were able to lead them more effectively. Lesson number 2, worker voice matters. Dr. King once said that a riot is the voice of the unheard. Well, when frontline workers feel unheard, when their legitimate frustrations aren't addressed by employers, at best, they part ways and leave businesses scrambling to hire and train new workers. But at worst, their frustrations erupt into protest and violence, the likes of what we're seeing right now with millions of farmers in India. We've done a series of experiments in which we provided frontline workers with technology to amplify their voices. This tech could take different forms, a text-based tool or an app, but it's essentially just a channel through which workers can engage in two-way anonymous communication with their managers. And the anonymity bit is crucial to establishing the trust that workers need to voice their concerns without fear of getting fired or passed over for a promotion. So if a worker feels, for example, that her boss has made inappropriate comments about her appearance at work, she can report that behavior anonymously, then follow up with more details, and have HR or upper management take action and address the negative behavior. Through our experiments, we've again and again unearthed the same basic facts about worker voice. Frontline workers have very limited ability to voice their concerns. They're dissatisfied about their wages and about the way that they're treated in the workplace. And when you give them an outlet to voice these concerns, their satisfaction levels rise, they stick around longer at their jobs, and they put in more effort. And this works, by the way, even if a small fraction of the workforce feels disenfranchised at any given time. Just knowing that you can reach out to someone if you need to, and that your concerns will be appropriately addressed, that's what's valuable to workers. Especially in industries where hiring and training costs are large, retaining more of your frontline workforce ends up being extremely valuable for businesses as well. Lesson number 3, environmental concerns matter in the workplace. Frontline workers, especially those in urban low-income country contexts, deal with extreme heat and pollution on a daily basis. And this is only going to worsen over time with the impacts of climate change. Just this past summer, in the middle of COVID-related lockdowns, the temperature in Delhi approached 50 degrees Celsius. And when that heat subsides, several of India's largest cities have the worst pollution of any place on Earth. Just showing up to work during those times is like smoking several packs of cigarettes a day. Not only are these conditions obviously bad for workers' health, but they're also incredibly bad for productivity. But we found that evidence from outside the lab on that link was pretty scant. So to fill that gap, we went out and installed little sensors all over factory floors and then collected data over a long period of time on temperature and pollution. And then we matched these data to detailed worker productivity information from the same factors. What we found was really startling. For every 1 degree Celsius the temperature increases, productivity decreases by a whopping 4%. spikes in pollution have similar but slightly smaller impacts. And what this means is that for businesses who have to operate under these conditions, investing in common sense mitigation measures, things like up-to-date ventilation systems or N95 masks for workers, these things can seem costly up front, but they can have transformative effects on both worker health and safety, as well as the firm's bottom line. And there's a fourth lesson that we've learned, this one the hard way, and that is that change doesn't come easy. Creating the evidence base that demonstrates exactly how worker well-being translates into good business is a necessary first step, but most of the time, information alone isn't enough to convince businesses to take that leap. Managers usually don't have the time or attention to do things like new trainings or develop technology in-house or research the right kinds of well-being initiatives for their workers. So a big part of what the team at Good Business Lab does is translate these research insights into easily consumable products and services, and also help our firm partners design and implement their own solutions. Because my goal in doing this research is not just to publish it and admire the work on my shelf, which, let's be honest, I do from time to time, but it's also to use those insights to affect real change in the lives of frontline workers across the world. And that's also where you come in. There has never been a more appropriate time than now to reach out and start a conversation about ways to invest a little bit more in your organization's frontline workers. Change always begins by challenging the status quo. Change making is just as much about reshaping norms and culture as it is about evidence-based decision making. So whether you're a business owner, an executive, a manager, or maybe you're a frontline worker yourself, whatever role you play, you can take this small concrete step to help shape a new culture around worker well-being. Because when our voices echo together, our whispers become a shout, and together we can move closer to the ideal of shared prosperity in our time. Thank you.
Well, Professor, thank you so much. That was just such an interesting look into the whole notion of the research that you do in terms of not just worker well-being, but company well-being. When you mentioned soft skills, I know this has become a critical factor in today's work environment, and particularly in a work environment that is more and more being affected by technology usage. Can you just give us some kind of idea of what you think are the 6 key soft skills?
Good question. And so you're absolutely right that soft skills are incredibly important. And I think one of the things we've discovered through our research is that not only are they important in sort of corporate contexts, knowledge worker contexts, where we know that these skills are really valuable and companies actually invest a lot in training managers and upper level employees in these skills, but we are realizing that when you look further down the supply chain, what you find is that these skills are also incredibly valuable for the frontline workers and for their immediate managers. So some of the really important soft skills that we've discovered in our work in garment worker settings is communication, collaboration, and sort of confidence. These skills are incredibly important because they allow frontline workers to kind of have their own agency and feel comfortable coordinating production with their peers, but also importantly their bosses. And so this is kind of a huge feature, particularly for frontline workers, all around the world, and especially I think in India, and particularly when you're thinking about women workers. There's often an inherent, socially constructed power dynamic that kind of enables, the power structure kind of enables, the superiors of women, so supervisors, middle managers, and things like that, to sort of treat workers like cogs, right? Just pieces in a machine. And what I think soft skills enable women to do is kind of empower themselves to speak up, resolve their own production problems, have their own autonomy and sense of empowerment, and that's actually what drives productivity in these settings.
Such an important area. So you conducted a massive research study at one of the largest garment manufacturers in the world. And this is a company in the Karnataka area of India. Can you give us just a little bit of background about that? Because why this was so key was, of course, the garment industry is a massive industry for India, and fashion products all over the world are so essential. But just give us a sense of what your study was supposed to try and look for and what outcomes surprised you.
Sure. So, first, the garment industry, I think, is a fascinating industry to think about, the power of worker empowerment, worker well-being, because it affects all of us. As I mentioned in the talk, we're all wearing shirts that were probably, sewn by a garment worker, who lives a very different life than we do, and we often don't think about that. But I think the pandemic has really shown us that, the lives of those workers matter, and when the lives of those workers are interrupted by things like coronavirus, but also just more everyday things like their financial struggles, their health struggles, etc., that our lives can be impacted as well. So what we have been doing for the past, I think, close to a decade now, is collaborating with a large garment manufacturer in India called Shahi Exports, actually the largest export manufacturer in India and one of the largest in the world, to implement a whole host of worker well-being programs. And we started with a soft skills program because, walking through the factories, one of the first things we noticed was this sort of inherent power structure and what we felt was sort of a lack of empowerment from the frontline workers. So evaluating that program, I think, was a huge struggle and a gargantuan effort, and we are very lucky to have Shahi as a partner in that effort. And I think we can speak more about that when we think, when I talk more about the process. But the incredible things that we learned were these workers, when they, before they came into our program, started out at a level of soft skills, things like confidence, communication levels that were very, very low. And, we thought, wow, how does production even happen in these settings when you have this sort of breakdown of communication and, breakdown of kind of an ability to speak up. But as we went through the program, we just saw more and more that the women workers that were involved kind of blossomed, and the training enabled them, kind of tapped into aspects of their personalities that already existed, but weren't manifesting themselves in the workplace. And so one of the most surprising things to me was just that visceral change that we saw in workers. And in terms of the productivity impacts, we were fairly surprised by the magnitude of the impacts. So the fact that this kind of helped productivity wasn't particularly surprising to us, but the fact that it changed productivity by that much, around 13%, and the fact that that change persisted over the course of almost a year after the program ended, that's what really kind of struck us as important, because what it tells us is that a one-time training, which actually ended up costing not very much to the firm, can actually have pretty substantial impacts that last long afterward. And so that helped make the business case as well.
So with a company like Shahi Exports, how many employees were there in that area that you did your research? Was it 100, 200, 1,000? Was it a large grouping of people?
So in our research, when we run these kind of A/B experiments, we always kind of strive to have large sample sizes. And part of that is to have statistical power and all that kind of boring stuff, but it's also because what we aim to achieve is some sort of pathway to scale. So whenever we run our experiments, we try to do them at a scale that might be replicable elsewhere, right? So if we run something with 30 workers or 50 workers, that might go great, but then when we expand to 1,000 or 30,000, things start breaking down. So we actually do our experiments when we can at scale. So this, our soft skills training experiments, some of them actually involve, upwards of 50 factories, across Karnataka. And, in terms of the reach, it's pretty incredible. And this is kind of, one of the major points of our research is basically to say, government intervention is great, and I heartily encourage government programs that target low-income workers. But sometimes you can reach these low-income workers best at the firms where they come and show up to work every day. And for example, at Shahi, there's something like 100 or 110,000 workers that they employ. That's an incredible amount of impact that you could have just by changing one corporate policy. And there's lots of firms like that and lots of examples like that all around the world, where just changing a small way that you run your company can actually have meaningful impacts in the lives of a lot of low-income people.
Interesting, this whole notion of what helps productivity, and of course productivity helps a company to become successful. Doesn't necessarily mean profits, but it helps the spirit and the vibe of the company. Something that is a big issue with many people who are working in jobs in India is sometimes they say that dealing with managers above them, the managers can be like slave masters rather than colleagues. So is there a way in which firms can pair up workers with managers? Is there something that we can give some guidance to all of those people watching this session that are working in jobs that can maybe improve the situation where there just seems to be a world war between the supervisor and the people in the company?
That's right. It's a great point. There's an old adage that says you don't quit your job, you quit your boss. And often what we see is that frontline workers, particularly in contexts like India, end up leaving firms because they're just so frustrated with the treatment that they get in the workplace every day. And when you talk to workers and managers alike, what you find is that there's something of a sort of a negative culture around this, particularly around frontline workers and their immediate managers. As I mentioned before, the kind of view is often that frontline workers are a dime a dozen. They're going to leave anyway, and so we might as well sort of get as much production out of them as we can. And we sort of aim to redefine that view, and one of the ways we do that is not only by targeting the soft skills and the confidence levels and communication of frontline workers, but it's also by targeting the soft skills and the way that managers, especially those middle managers, end up leading their teams. And so it's incredibly important. We've just finished up a trial in which we target soft skills like emotional regulation and management, conflict and stress management, open communication, planning, and a whole host of other soft skills for middle managers. And what we found was when we train managers in those skills, it actually turns out that their teams become much more effective. And the big reason why that is because those teams feel more comfortable, more satisfied at work, and they leave at less and less risks. So, if I were to give a lesson or a learning in terms of this to folks out there who are thinking about how to solve that management problem, particularly for middle managers, it would be that concentrating on the soft skills of those middle managers is incredibly, incredibly important, because that impact kind of trickles down to the well-being of the front line.
Amazing. So interesting the way that business and business organization, particularly when you're looking at the key areas that you look at, for example, on health and healthcare, and particularly what you mentioned earlier on about pollution, and particularly in some of these large manufacturing businesses, just in a garment factory where there are particulates, little pieces of fiber that might actually affect people's lung capacity or just their breathing. I mean, these are now important issues. When you mentioned the temperature in Delhi going up to 50 degrees centigrade, and then having to work in some large factory environment that's not properly air conditioned or ventilated, these are obviously modern day issues, but in general, what happens when you're dealing in the dirty industries? Like, for example, if you're dealing with mining or you're dealing with, because each industry's got its own particular imperatives for workers' conditions.
That's right. So one lesson is that, the solutions that we're discussing here are absolutely context and industry dependent. So, as firms go about thinking through what is going to work for their workforce, it's important to consider the particulars of the industry. As you mentioned, in the garment setting, there's lots of little particulates that are created by production on the garment factory floor, and that's important to consider. In other industries, there's other kinds of pollutants and negative health impacts that occur because of that particular kind of production. So, for example, in construction, ergonomic factors are incredibly important for workers. So it's really, really important to dive down into the context. That's the first point. And then the second is, health in general is absolutely critical. We've seen this in an obvious way in the pandemic where, firms have taken the health of workers incredibly seriously now because they have to. But there are, smaller or more nuanced health interventions that might make huge impacts as well. And this is an area where we continue to run trials, to run studies, to figure out exactly what's going to work in what setting. And I think it's really important, for example, for these firms in sort of dirty or polluting industries, that they target the types of interventions that they think might work for their front line.
So, Professor, here's an interesting thing, and it's a distillation of some of the comments we've been getting some good questions from our audience. And those of you who haven't sent in questions, we'd love to hear from you because Professor Achyuta would definitely be interested in listening to your comments. There's a linkage between the low-income employees, because a lot of people, particularly in India, don't earn high executive salaries as you sometimes see in America or in Silicon Valley or in companies around the world. And is there a link between making sure of the well-being of your low-income employees and the success of the company or the success of the business? Low income, it's such an important issue.
Absolutely. So I think, low income often sort of goes along with or is correlated with the front line, right? So most frontline workers, for example, in the apparel industry, garment industry, are going to be low-income workers because those are kind of entry-level positions. A lot of workers who are coming into the workforce, the formal workforce, for the first time, making the transition from agriculture into factory work. And so you do actually, find that a big fraction of frontline workers are low-income workers as well. But there's a lot of, specific things that businesses can do to target the particular features of low-income workers. So, for example, low-income workers suffer really large financial shocks all the time. So, for example, when someone in their household gets sick, because of a lack of well-functioning insurance systems, etc., they're going to have to pay out of pocket for that or take a big loan. And that's actually what drives a lot of first-time workers, low-income workers, out of the workplace. So what can businesses do? Well, they can get involved. They can actually extend some of the health benefits that they offer workers to their families as well, so that those financial shocks are a little bit dampened. And there's a lot of other kinds of interventions that target kind of low-income workforces that have the particular issues that go with not having enough income. So, for example, not having adequate savings or investment mechanisms available to them, or not having access to the appropriate kinds of education opportunities or skill building opportunities for their children. I think these are all ways in which having the business become involved actually ends up being efficient, because people stick around longer at the workplace when they're getting extra benefits, when they feel like the firm cares. And these are all ways in which kind of involving the low-income workforce and kind of paying attention to their special needs ends up generating impacts for firms as well.
So, Professor, a lot has been written over the last 20 years, or 22 years, since Google started, about the way that Google developed special benefits for workers, like, for example, free meals, free dry cleaning, free transportation to and from the company. And some of those have been adopted by a lot of the tech companies in Bangalore and Hyderabad, Pune, and Mumbai, and Delhi, of course. But I've got three questions from some of our viewers, and I'd like to ask you these questions. We've got one from Ramesh Mitra Godri. Ramesh, thanks so much for the question. The question is, how does one balance between affordability and workers' wants? Then there's a second part to that question by Parijat Mukhopadhyay, and Parijat wants to know what would be the best approach to negotiate the workers' union demands, for example, in the present situations. I guess, for example, the farmers' demands in Delhi, and such an important issue for India.
That's right. So let me take the first question first. I think there's always, going to be costs involved in investment. And I guess, one of the key things that Good Business Lab focuses on, and I focus on in my own research, is understanding what the return on that investment is for any particular kind of initiative or solution. So it's not the case that every investment that you make in frontline workers is going to pay off. And so this kind of gets at this kind of affordability trade-off. You want to basically pick from a menu of investments that with high probability are actually going to result in gains in well-being, but also gains for the business. And so that's kind of what we seek to provide through Good Business Lab's work is, what kinds of investments tend to matter, what kinds of things are going to be useful to the firm, and what kinds of things end up not having that much of an impact. So I think that's an important question, and one that's very specific to the context or to the specific type of investment. The second question is a really complicated one, and we could probably devote the rest of our time to thinking about it.
Right.
But I'll say in short that I'm absolutely for the right to organize and the power that you generate by workers collectively bargaining with other power structures. And so it's incredibly important to have that power, and when you have limits set on that power, I think that results in decreases in well-being for workers, and ultimately, I think, also for firms. One of the things that we think a lot about when we're designing these experiments and encouraging firms to adopt initiatives that improve worker well-being, these aren't substitutes by any means to actual kind of representation or collective bargaining rights. So these are kind of things that we think for industries where you have really weak union presence, or a lot of industries basically have no union presence at all. In those kinds of places, you can still do things that make sense for businesses, but also improve workers' lives. I think that will eventually, hopefully, lead to more kind of collective representation, more kind of speaking up. A lot of the things we find matter actually correlate with that. So, for example, soft skills like communication and confidence should naturally lead frontline workers to voice their concerns and get together and bargain collectively with the employer. Worker voice, as well, as you improve the ability for workers to voice their legitimate frustrations, you're also improving their kind of ability to organize around that. And so I hope what we're seeing in India is a very, very complex issue, and I hope that it comes to a successful resolution soon. But I think it's incredibly important for farmers or any frontline worker to be able to collectively kind of express their demands and reach a resolution with employers.
Great. Just so interesting hearing your articulation of such a vital question, not just for India, but all over the world, really, the whole notion of hearing people's voices. And when I think of some of the great Indian companies, and I was just thinking, for example, of the Aditya Birla Group that are well known for taking care of workers, or certainly the Tata Group, a great example from Ratan Tata over many, many years, or even Infosys as an example, and the way that they really looked after, almost in a Silicon Valley kind of way, their worker benefits. And of course, Godrej Industries, another very important major Indian company that is really got a reputation for taking care of things. Here's an interesting question from Deepak Raval, who's, I don't know where Deepak is sending this to us from, but it's very, very topical. Question is this: did you carry out any research on people doing WFH? WFH, working from home. How and why does it help people become more productive when the work from home is going on? And what are your tips for companies and employees to maximize their productivity when WFH?
So we haven't done any particular work on this, but I know of some really nice work that's been done by colleagues at Stanford and elsewhere. The takeaway message is this: when you enable working from home, and this research was done, prior to the pandemic in China, I believe. You can actually, expand productivity, but potentially with the negative consequences that we all know about over time of being sort of trapped in your own abode and getting distracted and all that kind of stuff. So actually, what this research found was, when workers were given a chance to work from home, first of all, a lot of them chose to do so, and they were more productive as a result of that for a certain period of time. And then that productivity effect sort of faded out, and they actually became, if anything, a little bit less productive than their workers who were, in the office. And I think that we can probably relate to that experience. I'm not sure if, all of us started out more productive when we started work, but there are certain features like skipping out on a commute, not having to dress up for work, and all that stuff that kind of helps you gain or recover some time from the day. But I will say, as we think about work from home versus not, et cetera, and this kind of transition, which we're all having to undergo as things approach some semblance of normal after the pandemic, that frontline workers often had no choice whatsoever, right? For example, there were a lot of migrants who were just stuck in cities, and there's a huge issue. And so a lot of those migrants were workers who were going to work, every day, kind of keeping the train on the tracks in the global economy. So I think it was, as we contemplate, sort of the positives and negatives of working from home, it's important to remember there's a whole, millions and millions of people who were actually, had to come into work every day and had no choice. And so I think, understanding that dichotomy is kind of important to thinking through what we're talking about right now with respect to worker well-being for the sort of lowest rung.
It's interesting. So many companies around the world are now quite happy with their employees working from home. Google put out something recently to say that people can work from home for the next year or two. Unilever, one of the largest companies in the world, have also said that they've got a big setup in India. Here's an interesting question from Dr. Balaji Sadavate. Dr. Sadavate wants to know the following. This era is an era of the customer is the king. And in such a juncture, do you think that paying attention towards workers is more important than paying attention towards the customer? What do you say?
Well, that's a great point. I think, in some sense, it's been this era, and that era has stretched decades. And this is why we've seen some of the kind of erosions that we have in terms of worker rights and the way that workers are treated, conditions in the workplace, et cetera. Just to take garments as an example again, we all, heard about the tragic Rana Plaza collapse and the many workers that perished in that incident in Bangladesh. And part of what leads to those poor conditions is the kind of end consumer, right? Because we, as end consumers, just want to pay the least amount we can for a T-shirt, and if we can pay, next to nothing for a T-shirt, we will. And so that force, kind of drives us to be inadvertently a part of this. I think you're absolutely right. The question's right that if we don't change that mindset or that culture, then we're never going to, ultimately kind of see the transformations that we'd like realized. So I think we have to change this basic idea that the end consumer, deserves the lowest price, product possible. And there's a lot of companies, great examples, in the U.S., like Patagonia is a really good example of this.
That's Patagonia, the product?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Lots of other companies are kind of taking the time to invest in their workers and then making that part of their business model and their sales pitch. And so, they're appealing to a set of customers who say, you know what, I'm willing to pay a little bit more to make sure that I, don't have this feeling of guilt when I'm putting on my T-shirt. I think that's just a small fraction of the entire market, unfortunately, but that's kind of a good sign. I think ultimately we need to change that culture, and otherwise, we won't see wholesale reforms being realized.
So here's a question for you. It seems to me from the research that you do and the wide levels of work that you do about productivity and worker health and worker wellness, what is the value of experimentation to you? I mean, is it important to expand the worker well-being space? Is that smart business because you expand worker well-being, you expand the effective management and operation of a company, which means maybe then you'll expand the profitability and the benefits to all?
That's right. So, one of the things I think is part of the DNA of an academic, but also I think part of the DNA of smart companies is to do A/B testing, right? Let's not assume that something works. Let's actually test it and then figure out whether it works compared to some alternative. So, that's what we do in all of our studies and our experiments. And I think companies already do this with a whole host of different products and services that they offer, right? Google is not going to introduce a change to its search algorithm or a change to its website parameters if it doesn't test it and make sure that it works, performs better than the alternative, the current status quo. So why can't companies take that same mindset and apply it to the way that they treat workers? So doing these kind of mini experiments, and they don't need to be studies that involve thousands and thousands of workers, but every company can do little trials on their own to figure out what works for them, because ultimately, what we're putting out is a sense of what solutions or categories of investments tend to work. But in your particular context, you have to try that out for yourself, and maybe it's going to end up helping your bottom line, and maybe it's not. And so it's really, really important to build this culture of experimentation. So I absolutely agree.
So here's an interesting question for you, Professor, and this comes from Indranil Mandal. Indranil is sending this to us from Ghaziabad, near Delhi. Indranil, thanks for the question, and the question is this. Indranil says, I just wanted to ask, with there being concerns about India losing the much-touted demographic dividend, in your view, has the pandemic only made things worse vis-a-vis the future?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't want to speculate about what's coming with respect to demographics and how that impacts the economy. What I will say, is that what we've seen as a general trend is that a lot of back office work, as well as a lot of production work that used to happen in India, has now migrated outside of India's borders. It's going to places like East Africa and Southeast Asia, etc. And that's because, as we've seen wages and labor conditions, labor rights improving in India overall, we're seeing, companies actually noticing that their costs have been ticking up, and they move to places where there's lower cost. In terms of sort of what that holds for India as we kind of transition out of the pandemic, I think I don't want to speculate on, but what I will say is part of that is kind of the inevitable trend that most, it's a path of development that's well trod. The U.S., followed a similar path. Western Europe followed a similar path. And I think India will ultimately follow that path as well. What this means is, I think India is taking a lot of the right steps to build a knowledge economy, to have a lot of its workforce transition from kind of manufacturing into kind of knowledge-based products, and that's a really important and productive step to take.
So smart manufacturing equals smart workforce, healthier workforce, better workforce. Here's an interesting question from Kashitij Saraf. And Kashitij asks an interesting question. Kashitij says, Indian firms, or some Indian firms, are known for their toxic culture. And I'm sure we know many like that, at the macro level. So those firms that have a toxic culture at the macro level, do you see the willingness of business owners and top management to evolve their culture amidst the changing world? In other words, is it, do you think, reasonable to expect that some of these so-called toxic managers can be shown that there is a benefit to treating your staff better? And those companies that do see a dividend in terms of the company's performance and the profitability.
I absolutely think that is the goal. Now, how do we realize that goal? I think that's a different question, right? And I mentioned at the end of my talk that change doesn't come easy, and I think that's absolutely true. We've shown lots of companies some of the results that we're getting from our trials, and we've gotten lots of kudos and slaps on the back, but at the end of the day, nobody actually kind of takes action unless there's kind of a lot of hand-holding involved, right? And so I think that is changing the culture from a toxic one to a happier place to work. That's a long transition, and ultimately the pressures that the industry puts on those companies to actually reform their ways will be incredibly important. So I think as much as the information that we're generating is going to help change people's mindsets and convince these cultures that they should change, not only because it's the right thing to do, it's also good for their bottom line. I think it's also important that we continue putting societal pressure, government pressure, etc., to crack down and regulate that kind of culture. We've seen a lot of that, for example, with the Me Too movement, where we've seen a huge culture change as a result of that in a very short period of time. So it's possible. It just takes a lot of coordination and some brave folks stepping up.
And of course, just the right thing to do. The Me Too movement really rippling all over the world, from what started out maybe in the movie business, the Bollywood business, or the Hollywood business, or the Nollywood business, has really manifested into some of these other industries. Here's an interesting question from Mahesh Krishnamurti, and maybe Professor, you can also interpret this particular question. And Mahesh wants to know, would you agree that the rising importance of ESG integration into business operations and greater insistence from investors on an impact and ESG focus will over time ensure better treatment of workers in all parts of the organization? What is ESG?
So, I think Mahesh is talking about environmental and social governance, and
that's it.
Right, and so, I think that has been a part of the kind of global supply chain business model for quite some time. And I think over time we've seen a rise in its importance. So it started out as something, that we just want to tick a few boxes and make sure that we're not, violating any particular laws or codes in a country we're producing. But I think we've seen it evolve quite a bit, where ESG and other kind of social environmental compliance related issues have taken the forefront in a lot of settings, and are a big part of who gets to be part of the supply chain. So while I think that is important, I don't think we'll ever get across the sort of hump if we rely on kind of compliance alone, right? There's always ways to get around compliance. And we've seen that with the Rana Plaza collapse and many other examples of this across supply chains, globally, that you can do business with the biggest companies in the world and not care very much about your workers. So we have to have a shift in mindset that actually says, these suppliers stand to gain if they invest more in their workers. It's not just ticking a box because our, corporate buyer overlords would like us to, right? It's about understanding that investing more in our workforce is actually improving that workforce's productivity and investing more because of that. And I think ultimately, if we see that change, that's where we're going to see, the real movement in worker well-being. ESG can only take us so far.
Here's a great last question for this session today. Fascinating. You've brought such interesting thinking into the whole debate about this. And Fenil Patel has given us a cue in the Q&A, which is as follows. Fenil asks, did you discover any benefits to individuals beyond work settings? That is to say, if the worker conditions are improved, does that change their lives at home? Does it help in families? Does it ricochet in a positive way to the workers' environment? Because obviously when they go from work back to home, they would be in a better state of mind. What do you think about that?
That's right. So I think there's absolutely ways in which some of the things that you can deliver in the workplace impact not only that worker, but also that worker's family and community. And so just to give you one example of this that we have ongoing, we're working on a study right now that relates to alleviating loneliness and other mental health issues.
Wow, that is great.
And in that research, what we found is you can deliver a program that improves the mental health of a migrant worker, which is often kind of, in a very precarious state, particularly if this migrant's coming for the first time to a city or leaving his or her family for the first time. And you can actually, generate improvements in that person's mental health, which then kind of trickle over to not only their peers, but also their family. So that's just one example, but I think, a lot of the work that we do, workers bring their work problems home to their families like we all do. And so the opposite's also true, that if good things are happening at work, they come home as well and have beneficial impacts on the family. I'll say one last thing, in the soft skills programs that we've done, we've also found similar impacts in terms of investing in children. So one of the things that women who were part of the trainings where their confidence, communication skills, etc., improved, part of that actually led them to invest more in their children's education and build a better future for their children. So I think you'll start seeing those longer term impacts in the next generation as well.
So that's essentially community building, because if you are a company operating in a community, it's in your self-interest to be able to enhance that community, because that's also where you'll be getting some of your future employees coming in as well.
Absolutely, and this is a tried and true fact when you look at government policy that looks at place-based policies and programs. And I think every big corporation who's going to move into a new location or community knows that supporting the community is really important for business. And so just figuring out what those returns are is the tricky part. But we're hoping to do that and kind of make those widely known so that businesses can say, I can point to a number and tell you how much we're going to, see in kind of bottom line improvements if we kind of help out the communities that we work in.
Well, Professor Achyuta Adhvaryu, what a fantastic session. Thank you so much. All the way from Puerto Rico, halfway around the world. I'm in London, and TEDx Gateway, of course, in Mumbai and all over India and internationally. what a great session. So thank you all, everybody, that tuned in for today's session. We'll see you next week for a special session, Women Are Changing the World, on the 6th and the 7th of March, with 5 remarkable women, Shabana Basij Razik, Seema Anand, Rujuta Diwakar. That's going to be great. And then in addition, there will also be, on the 7th, we've got Captain Zoya Agarwal, an amazing woman, Madam Gandhi, a musician and activist, very interesting. And that's going to be a really, really important session, and especially so during the month of March, where there's a focus on women. And then on the 13th of March, also a special session by 2 people that are really well known on a global level, in particular Dr. Dean Ornish, who was a very close colleague of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, the president and founder of the Preventative Medicine Research Institute,